First class isn't for people like you, he said before learning who owned the airline. Marcus Thompson adjusted his laptop bag and approached Gate B47 at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport with the measured confidence of someone who had learned long ago that rushing rarely improved outcomes. At 45, his close-cropped hair showed distinguished touches of gray at the temples, and his simple navy polo and khakis gave no indication of the empire he'd built over 2 decades. He preferred it that way. Anonymous travel had become his small rebellion against a life that had grown increasingly public, increasingly scrutinized, increasingly isolated behind walls of corporate security and executive handlers. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gate area as Marcus settled into a corner seat, his weathered leather journal open on his lap. He'd been writing in it since his mother gave it to him 25 years ago, the day he graduated from Georgia Tech with $17 in his checking account and a head full of dreams. Now as CEO and majority owner of several tech companies, and through a recent quiet acquisition controlling shareholder of Southeastern Airways, he still carried the same journal, its pages a roadmap of failures and triumphs that had led him here. "Now boarding Group 1, our first-class passengers," the gate agent announced, her voice cutting through his reminiscence. Marcus closed the journal, tucked it carefully into his bag, and joined the short line. Behind him, he heard the familiar sounds of business travelers jostling for position, the subtle competition of status and priority that played out at every gate in every airport across America. He'd once been desperate to be part of that world. Now, having conquered it, he found it exhausting. "Good morning," he said pleasantly to the gate agent, handing over his phone with the mobile boarding pass displayed. She scanned it, frowned, scanned again. "Mr. Thompson, one moment, please." Marcus had seen this dance before. A black man in first class still raised eyebrows in certain circles, triggered double checks and verifications that his white counterparts sailed through without question. He waited patiently, knowing that frustration would only escalate the situation. "Is there a problem?" The voice came from behind him, dripping with barely concealed irritation. Marcus glanced back to see a man in his early 50s, expensive suit, impeccable gold watch catching the light, face already flushed with the particular indignation of someone unaccustomed to waiting. "No problem, sir, just verifying Mr. Thompson's seat assignment," the gate agent replied, still frowning at her screen. The man, Richard Whitman, according to the platinum frequent flyer tag on his Hermes briefcase, made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a laugh. "Verifying what's to verify? Either he belongs in first class or he doesn't." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus had heard variations of them his entire life. Belong, as if his presence in certain spaces was subject to approval by some invisible committee of gatekeepers. "The seat is confirmed," the gate agent finally said, handing Marcus back his phone with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, Mr. Thompson, enjoy your flight." "Thank you," Marcus replied, maintaining eye contact a moment longer than necessary, filing away her name tag, Jennifer, before proceeding down the jet bridge. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 737 was configured with 4 rows of seats, 2 on each side. Marcus found 1A, easily enough the window seat in the very first row, and stowed his bag in the overhead compartment with practiced efficiency. He'd specifically chosen this seat for its extra legroom and the ability to work without distraction during the 3-hour flight to New York. He had just settled in, pulling out his journal again, when a shadow fell across his row. "Excuse me." Richard Whitman stood in the aisle, his expression a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "You're in my seat." Marcus looked up calmly, though he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with these confrontations. "I don't believe so. This is 1A, which matches my boarding pass." Richard's face reddened. "That's impossible. I always sit in 1A. Always. There's been some mistake." "I'm happy to compare boarding passes," Marcus offered, reaching for his phone. Richard waved him off dismissively. "That won't be necessary. Obviously, there's been some sort of mix-up with the system." He turned to the flight attendant, who had just emerged from the galley, a woman in her 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a name tag reading Jennifer. Different from the gate agent, but the same name Marcus noted with grim amusement. "Jennifer," Richard began, his tone shifting to one of practiced authority. "There seems to be a problem with the seat assignments. This gentleman is in my seat." Jennifer's professional smile faltered slightly as she looked between the two men. Her gaze lingered on Marcus, taking in his casual attire, before turning back to Richard with notably warmer attention. "Let me check on that for you, Mr. Whitman," she said, and Marcus didn't miss how she knew Richard's name without asking. "Sir," she addressed Marcus, "may I see your boarding pass?" Marcus handed over his phone, watching as she scrutinized it with the same skepticism the gate agent had shown. Meanwhile, Richard stood with arms crossed, tapping his foot impatiently, playing to the small audience of other first-class passengers who were beginning to board. "This does show 1A, Jennifer admitted reluctantly. "Mr. Whitman, what seat does your boarding pass show?" Richard pulled out his phone with obvious irritation, then frowned. 1B, but that's wrong. I specifically requested 1A. I always have 1A. "I apologize for the confusion, sir. 1B is the aisle seat right here. Still a premium first-class seat with all the same amenities." "That's not the point," Richard interrupted. "I have a system. I have preferences. I'm a Diamond Elite member. This," he gestured at Marcus, "is unacceptable." The cabin was filling now, other passengers settling into their seats while trying not to obviously stare at the unfolding drama. Marcus caught the eye of an elderly black woman across the aisle in 2B, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. He'd seen that look before too, the silent communication between people who understood what was really happening here. "Sir," Jennifer addressed Marcus again, her tone taking on a conciliatory edge that made his stomach turn. "Would you be willing to switch seats? Mr. Whitman is one of our most valued customers, and it would really help us out if—" "No," Marcus said simply, his voice calm but firm. "I selected this seat specifically. I paid for it. I'm staying in it." The simplicity of his refusal seemed to shock both Richard and Jennifer. They'd expected negotiation, perhaps even gratitude for being allowed to remain in first class at all. Richard's face went from red to purple. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm the Senior Vice President of Operations for Whitman Industries. I spend over $200,000 a year with this airline. And you," he looked Marcus up and down with undisguised contempt, "you probably use miles or got some kind of upgrade." "Oh, actually," Marcus began, but Richard cut him off. "Jennifer, get me your supervisor. Better yet, get me the captain. This is ridiculous. I shouldn't have to explain to someone why they need to move." The someone hung in the air, loaded with unspoken qualifiers. Marcus had built a multi-billion-dollar empire, had his products in the pockets of half the country, had just 2 weeks ago quietly acquired 51% of this very airline's stock through a series of shelling companies. And yet here he was being told he didn't belong in a seat he'd paid for. Jennifer hesitated, clearly torn between corporate protocol and Richard's demands. Other passengers were growing restless, checking watches, making quiet phone calls about potential delays. "Is there a problem here?" A new voice entered the conversation. Captain Roberts, a black man in his 50s with silver at his temples and 4 stripes on his shoulders, had emerged from the cockpit. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic. "Captain," Richard began, his tone switching to one of practiced corporate networking. "There's been a seating mix-up. This gentleman is in my seat, 1A, and refuses to move." Captain Roberts looked at Marcus, and something passed between them. Not recognition, exactly, but understanding. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" "So." Marcus showed it once more, and the captain nodded. "Mr. Thompson is in his assigned seat. Mr. Whitman, I'll need you to take your assigned seat so we can complete boarding." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "This is— Do you not know who I am? I'll have your job for this. Both of your boss," he added, glancing at Marcus. "Sir," Captain Roberts said, his voice taking on an edge of authority, "I need you to take your seat now, or I'll have to ask security to escort you from the aircraft." For a moment, the entire first-class cabin held its breath. Richard looked around, seeking support from the other passengers, most of whom suddenly found their phones or magazines fascinating. His wife, Patricia, a thin woman with expensively maintained blonde hair, had boarded during the commotion and now stood frozen in the aisle behind him, her face a mask of mortification. "Richard," she said quietly, "please, just sit down." But Richard Whitman was not a man who backed down, especially not when he felt his status challenged. "This is discrimination," he said loudly, and the irony of the statement would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. "I'm being discriminated against as a loyal customer in favor of someone who clearly doesn't belong here." The words finally broke Marcus's composure. Not visibly, he'd learned long ago never to show anger in these situations, but internally something shifted. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to his assistant. Initiate Plan B for SA board meeting. Move timeline up. Mr. Whitman, Captain Roberts said, this is your last warning. Richard finally grudgingly dropped into 1B, but not before leaning across the aisle toward Marcus. This isn't over, he said quietly. I know people. Real people. People who matter. Marcus met his gaze steadily. So do I, he replied, simply, then returned to his journal. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Marcus heard Richard on his phone speaking loudly enough for everyone in first class to hear. Tom, it's Richard. You're not going to believe what this airline is letting happen. There's a situation here that needs addressing at the highest levels. Marcus smiled slightly and continued writing. If only Richard knew how high those levels actually went. The flight attendant, Jennifer, returned with pre-departure beverages, offering champagne to the first-class passengers. She served Richard first with enthusiasm and deference. When she reached Marcus, her smile was notably cooler. Champagne, sir, orange juice, please, Marcus replied. She returned with a glass that was barely half full, while Richard's champagne flute had been filled to the brim. These were the small indignities, the 1,000 tiny cuts that people like Richard never saw, never experienced, never had to consider. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus observed the cabin dynamics with the eye of someone who had spent years studying human behavior and organizational systems. Jennifer lavished attention on Richard refilling his drink before he asked, laughing at his jokes, while providing Marcus with the bare minimum of service. Other passengers had begun to relax, but he caught several glances his way, could practically hear them wondering, how did he afford first class? Was he an athlete, an entertainer? 20 minutes into the flight, Richard's voice rose again. He was regaling Jennifer and anyone within earshot with stories of his business accomplishments, his multiple homes, his children at Ivy League schools. Every anecdote was carefully crafted to reinforce his importance, his belonging, his superiority. The problem with airlines today, Richard said, gesturing with his third glass of champagne, is that they've forgotten who their real customers are. They cater to everyone, dilute the experience. First class used to mean something. It used to be exclusive. Exclusive. Marcus wrote the word in his journal, underlining it twice. He thought of his mother, who had cleaned office buildings at night to put him through school. She'd never flown first class, never even been on a plane until he'd bought her a ticket to his college graduation. She'd been so nervous, so worried about doing something wrong, about not belonging. The elderly black woman in 2B, Mrs. Hartford, according to the name on her boarding pass visible on her tray table, caught his eye again. This time she spoke. Young man, she said to Marcus, her voice carrying the authority of age and experience. You remind me of my grandson. He's about your age, works in technology up in Seattle. Richard snorted. Technology. Every other person claims to work in technology these days. Probably means they design websites or fix computers. Mrs. Hartford's eyes flashed, but she kept her attention on Marcus. He's actually the chief technology officer there at a Fortune 500 company. Started from nothing just like his grandmother. Worked 3 jobs to put himself through school. Impressive, Marcus said genuinely. You must be very proud. I am, she replied, then looked directly at Richard. Success comes in many forms, Mr. Whitman, and true class has nothing to do with which seat you occupy on an airplane. Richard's face flushed again, but before he could respond, his phone rang. He answered immediately, his voice taking on a different tone, worried, almost panicked. What do you mean the stock is dropping? That's impossible. What video? What are you talking about? Marcus glanced at his phone. The video had already been viewed 40,000 times in the 20 minutes since takeoff. Someone in the gate area had recorded Richard's entire tirade, including his declaration that Marcus didn't belong in first class. The comments section was already exploding and had flying, while black was trending. Patricia Whitman was looking at her phone now too, her face growing paler by the second. She showed the screen to her husband, whose expression cycled through confusion, anger, and then fear as he recognized the implications. Turn on the damn Wi-Fi, Richard barked at Jennifer. I need to get online now. Sir, the Wi-Fi won't be available for another few minutes. I don't care. This is an emergency. Do you understand my company, my reputation? Marcus continued writing in his journal, documenting the moment with the same attention to detail he'd applied to every major decision in his business career. He thought about revealing himself right then, about ending Richard's misery with the truth. But no, some lessons needed time to sink in. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Roberts. We've been notified of a situation that occurred during boarding that requires our attention. We'll be conducting ourselves according to Southeastern Airways' zero-tolerance policy on discrimination. I want to remind all passengers that every person on this aircraft deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, race, or any other factor." The announcement was unusual, specific, pointed. Richard's face went from pale to ashen. He looked at Marcus with new eyes, perhaps beginning to suspect that there was more to this situation than he'd assumed. "You," Richard said, his voice now uncertain. "You recorded this. You set me up." Marcus finally looked up from his journal. "I didn't record anything, Mr. Whitman. I didn't need to. Your behavior spoke for itself. As for setting you up, I simply sat in my assigned seat. Everything else was your choice. But the media attention, this could ruin me. You don't understand. I have investors, board members." "I understand perfectly," Marcus replied. "You're concerned about consequences. Interesting how that works." The Wi-Fi signal finally activated, and Richard immediately buried himself in his phone, frantically typing emails, sending messages, trying to control a narrative that had already escaped his grasp. Patricia hadn't said a word to him since boarding, her body language radiating mortification and something else. Perhaps relief that her husband's true nature was finally exposed to the world. Meanwhile, Marcus received a text from his assistant. "Board emergency meeting scheduled for landing. Williams is panicking. The video has hit 2 million views. Major news outlets picking it up. How do you want to proceed?" Marcus typed back, "Have the full ownership documentation ready. Time to introduce myself properly." As the plane began its descent into LaGuardia, Captain Roberts made another announcement. "Mr. Thompson, could you please come to the cockpit when we land? There's a matter that requires your attention." Richard looked up sharply. Why would the captain need to see Marcus unless? The pieces were starting to fall into place in Richard's mind. The calm confidence, the lack of reaction to threats, the captain's protective stance, the immediate viral explosion. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated. But orchestrated by whom? As the plane touched down, Marcus stood retrieving his bag from the overhead compartment with unhurried precision. Richard grabbed his arm. "Wait, who are you really?" Marcus gently but firmly removed Richard's hand. "I'm exactly who I've been this entire flight, Mr. Whitman. A man who paid for his seat and expected to be treated with basic respect. The fact that you need to know who I am to determine whether I deserve that respect says everything about you and nothing about me." He walked toward the cockpit where Captain Roberts was waiting. They spoke quietly for a moment, the captain's eyes widening slightly, then nodding with what looked like satisfaction. "The ground crew is ready for you, sir," Captain Roberts said loud enough for the first-class cabin to hear. "Mr. Williams and the board are waiting in the conference room." Williams, the CEO of Southeastern Airways. Richard's mind raced. Why would the airline CEO be meeting with? "Oh my God," Patricia Whitman said suddenly, her voice cutting through the cabin. She was staring at her phone at an article that had just been published by the Wall Street Journal. "Richard, shut up. Stop talking. Stop everything." "What are you, She held up her phone. The headline read, "Tech billionaire Marcus Thompson reveals ownership of Southeastern Airways after discrimination incident goes viral." The article detailed how Thompson, founder of Thompson Technologies and quiet investor in dozens of companies, had recently acquired a controlling stake in Southeastern Airways through a series of shell companies. His net worth was estimated at $4 billion. His photo, the same man Richard had tried to force from his seat, stared back from the screen. The first-class cabin erupted in whispers. Phones came out. Searches were made, the truth spreading like wildfire through the small space. Jennifer, the flight attendant, looked like she might faint. Richard Whitman sat frozen, his mouth open, his face cycling through expressions like a broken slot machine. His phone rang, his company's chairman of the board. He didn't answer. It rang again. His biggest investor. He couldn't answer. His hands were shaking too badly. Marcus paused at the cockpit door and turned back to address the cabin. His voice was calm, measured the same tone he'd maintained throughout the flight. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be clear about something. What happened today isn't about one man's prejudice or one airline's failure. It's about a system that makes assumptions based on appearance, that determines worth based on perception rather than character. Mr. Whitman isn't uniquely evil. He's uniquely visible. His thoughts are shared by many who are simply better at hiding them. He looked directly at Richard. But hiding isn't the same as changing. And today, change begins with Southeastern Airways. Effective immediately, this airline will implement the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training and accountability program in the industry. Not because it's good PR, but because it's right. Then he looked at Jennifer. And it starts with our crew. Those who can't serve all passengers with equal respect and dignity won't serve at all. Jennifer's face crumbled. She knew what that meant for her job, her career. The preferential treatment she'd given Richard, the cold service she'd provided Marcus. It had all been documented, observed, recorded. Marcus turned to Mrs. Hartford, who was watching with a small, satisfied smile. Ma'am, I'd like to invite you to be part of our new passenger advisory board if you're interested. We need voices like yours. She nodded regally. I accept, young man. Finally, Marcus addressed Richard one more time. Mr. Whitman, you asked who I am. I'm someone who was once denied a job at your company because, as your HR director put it, I wouldn't fit the corporate culture. That was 15 years ago. I started my own company instead. That company is now worth more than Whitman Industries will ever be. But this isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring no one else has to build an empire just to be treated with basic human dignity. As Marcus stood to leave the aircraft, the full weight of what had just transpired began to settle over the first-class cabin like a heavy fog. Richard Whitman remained frozen in his seat, his phone vibrating incessantly with calls he couldn't bring himself to answer. His wife Patricia had moved to an empty seat 2 rows back, physically distancing herself from the disaster her husband had created. Mr. Thompson, a young black flight attendant, appeared from the economy section. Her name tag read Keisha, and unlike Jennifer, her expression held a mixture of admiration and vindication. I wanted to thank you. I've been filing complaints about differential treatment for 2 years. No one listened until today. Marcus paused, giving her his full attention. What kind of complaints? Keisha glanced at Jennifer, who was now crying quietly in the galley. Seat assignments mysteriously changing when certain passengers board. Drink service prioritized by perceived status rather than seat order. Complaints from passengers of color dismissed, while similar complaints from white passengers trigger immediate responses. I have documentation. I'd like to see that documentation, Marcus said. In fact, I'd like you to present it to the board meeting happening in 30 minutes. Can you do that? Keisha's eyes widened. Yes, sir, absolutely. As Marcus finally exited the aircraft, the ground crew waiting for him included David Williams, CEO of Southeastern Airways. Or rather, former CEO, as he was about to learn. Williams, a man in his 60s with the kind of artificial tan that suggested more time on golf courses than in boardrooms, extended his hand with a politician's smile. Mr. Thompson, I had no idea you were on this flight. If I had known... That's exactly the problem, Williams, Marcus interrupted, not taking the offered hand. You would have treated me differently if you had known. That's not leadership. That's opportunism. The walk through LaGuardia was surreal. The video had now been viewed over 10 million times. Marcus could hear his name being whispered, see phones raised to capture his passage. But he maintained his purposeful stride, following Williams to a private conference room the airline maintained for executive meetings. The room was already full. The entire board of directors had been assembled via emergency protocol. Some were physically present, others appearing on screens mounted around the room. Their expressions ranged from confused to terrified. Most had only learned of Marcus's ownership stake in the last hour. Gentlemen, ladies, Marcus began without preamble, taking the seat at the head of the table that Williams had been moving toward. 53 days ago, I acquired 51% of Southeastern Airways through a series of strategic purchases. I did so quietly because I wanted to observe operations without the performance that comes with announced oversight. What I've observed has confirmed my worst suspicions. He pulled out his phone and projected the viral video onto the main screen. Several board members winced as they watched Richard's tirade play out. This is not an isolated incident, Marcus continued. This is systematic, cultural, embedded in your training, your policies, your corporate DNA, and it ends today. Williams attempted to regain control. Mr. Thompson, with all due respect, one passenger's behavior doesn't reflect one passenger. Marcus pulled up another video. This is from last month. A black family relocated from first class to economy because a white passenger felt uncomfortable. This is from 2 weeks ago. An Asian businessman asked to prove his ticket was legitimate 3 separate times. This is from yesterday. A Latina mother told her infant was too disruptive, while a white baby 2 rows back screamed for an hour without comment. The room fell silent. Marcus stood moving to the window that overlooked the tarmac where his plane sat. I bought this airline because I believed it could be better. But believing isn't enough. Change requires action, and action requires leadership. He turned back to the board. Mr. Williams, you're fired. Williams sputtered. You can't. I can, and I just did. Security will escort you out. Your severance package will be honored, but your tenure ends now. As security entered to escort a shocked Williams from the room, Marcus addressed the remaining board members. Each of you has a choice. Stay and be part of a transformation that will make Southeastern Airways the gold standard for inclusive excellence, or leave with your reputations intact. But if you stay, understand that the old ways are dead. We're not just changing policies, we're changing culture. Back on the plane, which had been held at the gate, Richard Whitman was experiencing the full force of public accountability. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. His company's stock had dropped 12% in an hour. 3 major clients had already announced they were reconsidering their contracts with Whitman Industries. And perhaps most painfully, his daughter had called from Harvard, crying and asking how he could be the man in that video. I need to get off this plane, Richard said to no one in particular. I need to fix this. But the door was closed. The plane had been held for Marcus's meeting, but other passengers still had connections to make. They were about to push back from the gate when Captain Roberts emerged from the cockpit again. Mr. Whitman, the captain said formally, you've been added to Southeastern Airways no-fly list pending investigation into your discriminatory behavior. Once we reach our destination, you'll need to make alternative arrangements for future travel. The announcement sent another wave of whispers through the cabin. A lifetime ban from an airline was almost unheard of for anything short of assault or security threats. But discrimination, Marcus had made clear, was a security threat to the safety and dignity of other passengers. Patricia Whitman finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed frustration. You've embarrassed me for the last time, Richard. I've watched you demean waiters, housekeepers, anyone you deem beneath you. I've made excuses, looked the other way, told myself it wasn't that bad. But it was. It always was. Patricia, not here. Yes, here. These people have seen who you really are. They should also see that I'm not like you, that I'm horrified by you, that I'm done with you. As the plane finally pushed back, Keisha emerged from economy with a folder thick with documents. She'd been preparing for this moment for years, collecting evidence, building a case that no one had wanted to hear. Until now, she sat in the empty seat across from Marcus. Mr. Thompson, this goes deeper than just customer service. There are promotion decisions, scheduling, preferences, even safety protocols that get applied differently based on race. I have names, dates, specific incidents. Marcus reviewed the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. How many others know about this? Every black and brown employee at this airline, Keisha said simply. We have a WhatsApp group. We share warnings, document incidents, support each other through the gaslighting. There are 300 of us. I want to meet with all of them, Marcus said, this week. We're going to rebuild this airline's culture from the ground up, and it starts with listening to those who've been silenced. Jennifer, who had been eavesdropping from the galley, suddenly appeared. Her face was blotchy from crying, her perfect makeup destroyed. Mr. Thompson, I want to apologize. I never considered myself racist, Marcus supplied when she couldn't finish. Most people don't. They think racism requires conscious hatred. But it doesn't. It lives in assumptions and comfort levels, in small preferences that add up to systematic exclusion. The question isn't whether you're racist. The question is what you're going to do about it now that you know. Jennifer nodded, seeming to grasp for the first time the weight of her actions. I want to do better. I want to learn. Good, Marcus said. You'll be part of the first group to go through our new training program. Not the usual corporate diversity workshop. Real training led by experts who understand implicit bias, historical context, and the psychology of prejudice. If you complete it successfully, you can keep your job. If not, you'll find work elsewhere. The plane landed at its destination, not New York as originally planned, but Atlanta, where Southeastern Airways was headquartered. Marcus had ordered the diversion mid-flight to deal with the crisis immediately. Passengers would be compensated and rebooked, but this moment required immediate action. As they deplaned, Richard Whitman found himself truly alone for perhaps the first time in his adult life. His wife had left in a separate Uber. His calls went unanswered. His presence in the terminal drew stares and whispers. The man who had spent his life believing in his own superiority was discovering what it felt like to be judged, ostracized, unwanted. Marcus, meanwhile, was surrounded by a growing crowd of Southeastern Airways employees. Word had spread through the airport that the new majority owner was here, that changes were coming, that someone was finally listening. Black pilots, Latino ground crew, Asian gate agents, all approaching with stories, suggestions, hope. We're having an all-hands meeting, Marcus announced to the assembled crowd. Right now, every Southeastern Airways employee in this airport. Concourse C, Gate 45, it's time for truth and reconciliation. The meeting space wasn't meant for hundreds of people, but they made it work. Employees stood in the aisles, sat on the floor, lined the walls. Marcus stood at the front, no podium, no PowerPoint, just him and his truth. I bought this airline with money, he began, but that doesn't make it mine. It belongs to you, the people who show up every day, who deal with difficult passengers, who keep planes in the air and on time. You've been doing this work despite a culture that devalues many of you. That ends today. He outlined his vision, immediate implementation of blind resume reviews for all positions, body cameras for all customer-facing staff to document interactions, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination from passengers or employees, and a profit-sharing program that ensured the success of the airline translated to success for its workers. But first, Marcus said, we need to address what happened today. Richard Whitman represents something larger than one man's prejudice. He represents a system that's been in place since commercial aviation began. The idea that some people deserve better treatment based on their appearance, their wealth, their connections. That system dies with Southeastern Airways. An older black baggage handler raised his hand. Mr. Thompson, I've been here 37 years. I've heard promises before. What makes this different? Marcus nodded, appreciating the skepticism. Fair question. What makes this different is that I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm giving you power. Effective immediately, we're establishing an employee oversight board with real authority, the power to veto executive decisions, to initiate investigations, to ensure accountability. Half the board will be frontline workers elected by your peers. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. This was unprecedented in the airline industry, perhaps in any industry. Meanwhile, in a Marriott hotel bar across from the airport, Richard Whitman sat alone nursing a whiskey and watching his life crumble on his phone screen. The video had been picked up by every major news outlet. CNN was running a segment called The Face of Privilege. His company's board had called an emergency meeting for the morning. Without him. His country club had already suspended his membership pending review. But perhaps the most painful message came from his son, a senior at Yale. Dad, I've spent 4 years defending you to my friends, telling them you weren't like that they didn't know the real you. Turns out I didn't know the real you. Don't contact me until you've figured out who you want to be. Richard wanted to be angry, to find someone else to blame, to rationalize his behavior as he always had. But sitting alone in that bar watching his carefully constructed world collapse, he couldn't escape the truth Marcus had spoken. This was all his choice. Back at the airport, Marcus was fielding questions from the assembled employees when his phone buzzed with a priority message from his legal team. Several other airlines had reached out concerned about the precedent. Southeastern Airways was setting. They wanted a meeting, wanted to understand his intentions, wanted to know if he planned to acquire other airlines. Marcus smiled. Competition was a beautiful thing. If Southeastern Airways became known as the airline, that truly treated all passengers and employees with dignity, other airlines would have to follow suit or lose market share. The change he'd initiated wouldn't be confined to one company. Mr. Thompson, Keisha approached him as the meeting was ending. I've been thinking, the real test isn't how we handle the Richard Whitmans of the world. They're easy to spot, easy to ban. The real test is how we handle the subtle stuff. The Jennifer situations, the unconscious biaso, the million small ways discrimination manifests. You're absolutely right, Marcus agreed. That's why I want you to head our new Department of Cultural Transformation. You've been documenting these issues for years. Now I want you to help solve them. Keisha's eyes widened. Sir, I'm just a flight attendant. No, Marcus interrupted. You're an observer, an analyst, a truth teller. You've been doing the work without the title or pay. Now you'll have both. As the crowd dispersed, energized and hopeful, Marcus made his way to the airline's corporate offices located in a building adjacent to the airport. The senior leadership team was assembled minus Williams, all looking various degrees of terrified and confused. Relax, Marcus told them. I'm not here to fire everyone, but I am here to be clear about expectations. This airline is going to become a model for corporate responsibility. We're going to prove that treating people right isn't just morally correct, it's profitable. Those who can embrace that vision will thrive here. Those who can't should start updating their resumes. The CFO, a woman named Sandra Chen, who had been notably quiet during the Williams era, raised her hand. Mr. Thompson, I've been pushing for diversity initiatives for years, but I was always told it wasn't financially prudent. I have a whole folder of proposals that were rejected. I want to see them all, Marcus said. In fact, I want everyone in this room to bring me their ideas that were shot down for being too progressive, too inclusive, too focused on employees rather than shareholders. Those are exactly the ideas we need now. As the meeting progressed, the atmosphere shifted from fear to excitement. These executives, constrained for years by a culture that prioritized profit over people, were suddenly free to innovate, to think bigger, to imagine what an airline could be when it served all passengers equally. But not everyone was ready for change. The head of marketing, a slick man named Bradley, pushed back. Mr. Thompson, while I appreciate your vision, we have to be realistic. Our first-class passengers expect a certain level of exclusivity. If we're seen as too accessible, we might lose our premium market. Marcus studied him for a moment. Bradley defined premium market for me. Well, business travelers, high net worth individuals, people who can afford. Stop, Marcus interrupted. You're defining people by their bank accounts. Our premium market is anyone who chooses to fly with us. A teacher using her savings to visit family is just as premium as a CEO flying to a meeting. If we can't see that, we're in the wrong business. Bradley's expression made it clear he didn't agree, but he was smart enough to stay quiet. Marcus made a mental note to watch him closely. As the day wore on, the ripple effects of the morning's incident continued to spread. Dignity in the skies was trending globally. Other airlines were releasing statements distancing themselves from discrimination, though none matched the concrete actions Southeastern Airways was taking. Richard Whitman's company stock had dropped 23% by market close. 3 board members had already announced their intention to step down. The sun was setting over Atlanta as Marcus stood in the CEO's office, his office now, looking out at planes taking off and landing. Each one represented hundreds of stories, hundreds of people trying to get somewhere that mattered to them. He thought about his mother, how proud she would have been to see him here, not just because of the success, but because of the purpose. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. Patricia Whitman entered, looking older than she had that morning, as if the day's events had aged her years and hours. Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry to bother you. I know you must be incredibly busy. Mrs. Whitman, Marcus said, gesturing to a chair, please sit. What can I do for you? She sat carefully, as if afraid she might break. I wanted to apologize. Not for Richard. He can apologize for himself if he ever finds the courage. But for me, for my silence, for my complicity. Marcus waited, letting her find her words. I've watched him belittle people for 27 years, she continued. Waiters, drivers, housekeepers, anyone he saw as beneath him. I told myself it wasn't my battle, that speaking up would only make it worse. But my silence made me part of it, didn't it? Yes, Marcus said simply. It did. She nodded, seeming relieved by his honesty. I'm leaving him. Filed for divorce an hour ago, but that's not enough. I want to do something meaningful. I have money, my own family money that Richard never touched. I want to use it to help. Marcus considered her offer. We're establishing a fund for employees who face discrimination to pursue education and advancement opportunities. Your contribution would be welcome, but more than money, we need voices like yours. People who've been complicit but want to change. Your story could help others recognize their own role in perpetuating discrimination. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. You want me to speak publicly? Only if you're willing. Redemption requires confession. Change requires acknowledgement. She took a deep breath. Yes, I'll do it. Richard won't like it, but I'm done caring what Richard likes. As Patricia left, Marcus's assistant informed him that someone else was waiting to see him. Richard Whitman himself, looking haggard and diminished. Nothing like the strutting executive from that morning. 5 minutes, Marcus said. That's all you get. Richard entered, his entire demeanor transformed. Gone was the arrogance, the assumption of superiority. In its place was something Marcus had rarely seen in men like Richard: genuine humility. I've lost everything, Richard began. My wife, my reputation, probably my job. My children won't speak to me. I'm on the no-fly list of an airline I flew with for 20 years. And the worst part is, I deserve it all. Marcus remained silent, offering neither comfort nor condemnation. I didn't come here for forgiveness, Richard continued. I know I don't deserve that. I came because I need to understand something. When you sat in that seat this morning, knowing who you were, knowing what you owned, why didn't you just tell me? Why let it go so far? Because if I had told you immediately, you would have apologized to Marcus Thompson, the billionaire, not to Marcus Thompson, the human being, Marcus replied. Your behavior would have changed because of my power, not because you recognize my dignity. That's not learning, that's just fear management. Richard nodded slowly. I've been managing fear my whole life. Fear that I wasn't good enough, smart enough, important enough. So I made myself feel bigger by making others feel smaller. And how did that work out for you? Marcus asked. I'm sitting here having lost everything that mattered, talking to a man I tried to humiliate this morning, who now controls my ability to travel for business. Richard laughed bitterly. I'd say it didn't work out at all. Marcus stood, signaling the meeting was over. Mr. Whitman, you're banned from this airline for 1 year. After that, you can apply for reinstatement, but only after completing a comprehensive anti-racism education program and performing 500 hours of community service with organizations serving underprivileged communities. Not because I think it will redeem you, but because I think it might teach you to see people you've spent your life looking through. Richard stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, my son was right. You do belong in first class. You belong anywhere you choose to be. I'm sorry it took destroying my life to see that. After Richard left, Marcus called a final meeting of the day, this time with the media. The press conference was held in the main terminal, with employees surrounding the podium. A visual representation of the unified front Southeastern Airways was presenting. Today, an incident occurred on one of our flights that revealed fundamental flaws in how we operate. Marcus began. Cameras flashing, reporters scribbling notes. Not just flaws in policy, but flaws in culture, in training, in basic human decency. That changes now. He outlined the comprehensive reforms: mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, body cameras for accountability, the Employee Oversight Board, blind hiring practices, and a revolutionary profit-sharing program that would distribute 30% of profits directly to employees. But beyond policy, Marcus continued, we're changing philosophy. Every passenger who chooses Southeastern Airways is choosing dignity. Every employee who works for Southeastern Airways is choosing to uphold that dignity. We will no longer categorize passengers by their perceived value. Every seat on our planes is first class in terms of respect and service. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Thompson, aren't you concerned this will impact profitability? That shareholders will revolt? Marcus smiled. I am the majority shareholder, and I believe that treating people with dignity is not just compatible with profit. It's essential to it. Companies that recognize the full humanity of their customers and employees don't just succeed financially. they changed the world. On another reporter, what about Richard Whitman? Some are saying the lifetime ban is excessive for a verbal altercation. Mr. Whitman has been given a path to redemption, Marcus corrected. 1-year ban with clear steps for reinstatement. But let me be clear, discrimination is not just a verbal altercation. It's an assault on someone's fundamental humanity. We treat it with the seriousness it deserves. As the press conference ended and the reporters dispersed to file their stories, Marcus walked through the terminal one more time. Employees stopped him to shake his hand to share their stories to express hope that real change was finally coming. Near the gate where everything had started that morning, Marcus encountered Mrs. Hartford, the elderly woman from the flight. She was waiting for a connection, reading a book, looking serene amid the chaos of the airport. Mrs. Hartford, Marcus said, approaching her, I wanted to thank you again for speaking up on the plane. She looked up with a knowing smile. Young man, I've been speaking up for 78 years. March was the time nobody listens. Today the whole world heard. That's because of you, not me. I disagree, Marcus said. Change doesn't happen because of one person at the top. It happens because of many people at every level refusing to accept the unacceptable. You've probably been creating change your whole life, one conversation at a time. Mrs. Hartford studied him. You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago. A young man who integrated the lunch counters in Birmingham. He had your same quality. Powerful but humble, firm, but kind. He changed the world too, one lunch counter at a time. I'm just trying to change one airline, Marcus said. No. Mrs. Hartford disagreed. You're changing how people think about worth and dignity. That's much bigger than one airline. That's the whole world. 6 months later, Southeastern Airways had become the most profitable airline in North America. Applications to work for the company had increased by 400%. Customer satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. The Employee Oversight Board had successfully prevented 3 potentially discriminatory policies and had promoted dozens of minorities and women who had been overlooked for years. Richard Whitman, true to his word, was halfway through his community service working at a food bank in Atlanta. His divorce had been finalized, his company had restructured without him, but something unexpected had happened. He had found peace. For the first time in his life, he was serving others without expecting anything in return. His children had slowly begun speaking to him again, cautiously optimistic about the changes they saw. Patricia Whitman had become a powerful advocate for bystander intervention, traveling the country to speak about the cost of silence in the face of discrimination. Her TED Talk, The Comfortable Complicity of Privilege, had been viewed 12 million times. Jennifer, the flight attendant, had completed the anti-bias training and had become one of its most effective facilitators, using her own journey from unconscious bias to awareness as a teaching tool. She often said that being called out by Marcus Thompson was the best thing that ever happened to her, even though it had been the most painful. Keisha had transformed the Department of Cultural Transformation into a model being studied by corporations worldwide. She'd been featured on the cover of Business Week with the headline, The Flight Attendant Who Reformed an Industry, and Marcus Thompson. He rarely flew first class anymore, not because he couldn't afford it, but because he discovered that real connection happened in unexpected places. He'd have conversations with students in economy, business ideas sparked by discussions with families in premium economy, life lessons learned from elderly couples sharing their stories over pretzels and ginger ale. On this particular day, 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Marcus was flying from Atlanta to Seattle, sitting in seat 23C, the middle seat in economy by choice. Next to him, a young black boy, maybe 17, was nervously reviewing college applications on his laptop. Nervous about college? Marcus asked gently. The boy nodded. Full scholarship to MIT, but I'm worried I won't fit in. Kids like me, we don't usually go to places like that. Marcus smiled, thinking of his own journey of all the spaces he'd been told he didn't belong in. Let me tell you something important. You belong anywhere you choose to be. Don't let anyone, not classmates, not professors, not future employers, tell you different. Your presence in those spaces changes them for the better. The boy looked at him curiously. You sound like you know from experience. I do, Marcus said simply. I've been where you are. The key is to remember that belonging isn't something others give you. It's something you claim. As the plane lifted off, Marcus thought about transformation, not just of companies or policies, but of hearts and minds. Real change, he learned, didn't happen in boardrooms or press conferences. It happened in moments like this, one conversation at a time, one person refusing to accept limitations placed on them by others. The boy next to him had pulled up a news article on his phone. It was about Southeastern Airways and its remarkable transformation. "This is incredible," the boy said. "One person really changed an entire airline culture." Marcus looked at the article, at his own photo staring back at him. "No," he said, "one person started something, but thousands of people changed the culture. The flight attendants who spoke up, the pilots who demanded better, the passengers who chose dignity over discrimination. Change is never just one person. It's all of us together refusing to accept anything less than dignity for everyone." The boy nodded thoughtfully, then returned to his applications with what seemed like renewed confidence. Marcus smiled and closed his eyes, thinking of his mother, of her dignity in the face of discrimination, of her belief that the world could be better, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. She had been right. The world could be better. It just took someone sitting in seat 1A, refusing to move, refusing to accept that dignity depended on dollars, refusing to believe that some people belonged more than others. As the plane cruised through the clouds, Marcus pulled out his journal, the same one he'd written in that morning 6 months ago, and began to write, "Dignity is not negotiable. It is not dependent on wealth, race, or status. It is the birthright of every human being." Today, a young man learned that he belongs at MIT. 6 months ago, a billionaire learned that he belonged in any seat he chose. These truths are connected. When we claim our own dignity, we make it possible for others to claim theirs. When we refuse to be moved, we move the world. The transformation of Southeastern Airways became a case study in business schools, but more importantly, it became a catalyst for change across industries. Other airlines adopted similar policies. Corporations began examining their own cultures of discrimination. The phrase "dignity is not negotiable" became a rallying cry for a new kind of capitalism, one that recognized that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the dignity afforded to every human being. Richard Whitman completed his year of banishment in his 500 hours of community service. When he applied for reinstatement to Southeastern Airways, he included a letter that read in part, "I spent 52 years believing that worth was measured by wealth, that respect was earned by status, that belonging was determined by birth. I was wrong about everything. The man I tried to remove from seat 1A gave me the greatest gift of my life, the chance to learn who I really was and to become who I should have been all along." His reinstatement was approved, and on his first flight back, Richard found himself in economy middle seat next to a young black woman studying for her bar exam. When she apologized for taking up too much space with her books, Richard said, "Please don't apologize. You belong here as much as anyone. More actually, because you're working to make the world better. Can I buy you a coffee? I'd love to hear about your studies." The woman looked surprised but accepted. As they talked, Richard realized that this simple human connection across differences, was what he'd been missing his entire life. Not power, not status, but genuine human dignity offered and received freely. Back in his office in Atlanta, Marcus received word that Southeastern Airways had been ranked the #1 airline in customer satisfaction for the third consecutive quarter. But the achievement that made him proudest was a different statistic. Employee satisfaction was at 94%, with minority employees reporting feeling valued and respected at rates equal to their white counterparts for the first time in the airline's history. Keisha knocked on his door, entering with a smile. "The Department of Justice just called. They want to use our model for a federal anti-discrimination initiative. Transportation Secretary wants to meet with you next week." Marcus nodded. "Set it up, but I want you and Mrs. Hartford there too. This isn't my story to tell alone." As Keisha left, Marcus stood at his window again, watching planes take off and land. Each one carried hundreds of stories, hundreds of people seeking connection, purpose, dignity. Southeastern Airways couldn't guarantee they'd find what they were looking for at their destinations, but it could guarantee they'd be treated with dignity on the journey. His phone buzzed with a text from the young man from MIT, the one he'd sat next to months earlier. "Got into MIT starting this fall. Thank you for reminding me I belong. My presence will change it for the better." Marcus smiled, thinking of all the spaces that were being changed by people who'd been told they didn't belong there. Corporate boardrooms, university classrooms, first-class cabins, all being transformed by the simple act of claiming dignity, of refusing to be moved, of insisting that worth had nothing to do with wealth. The sun set over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand the vision of dignity for all. But tonight, Marcus Thompson allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Not because he'd won, this wasn't about winning or losing, but because he'd kept faith with the boy who'd once been told he didn't belong, with the mother who'd cleaned offices so her son could fly, with every person who'd ever been made to feel less than human because of how they looked or where they came from. The revolution hadn't started with buying an airline. It had started with refusing to move from seat 1A. Sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest acts of dignity. As darkness fell over the airport, planes continued to take off and land, each one carrying the promise that had been made that day, 6 months ago, on Southeastern Airways: dignity was not negotiable. Every passenger, regardless of race, wealth, or status, belonged. And in that belonging, in that simple recognition of shared humanity, the world was slowly, surely changing. Marcus closed his journal and prepared to head home. Tomorrow he would fly again, probably in economy, certainly in conversation with whoever sat beside him. Because that's where change really happened. Not in the first-class cabin of separation, but in the shared space of common humanity. The boy who'd been told he didn't belong had not just claimed his seat, he'd changed the meaning of belonging itself. And that, Marcus thought as he turned off his office lights, was how dignity won. 1 year later, the annual Dignity in the Skies conference filled the Georgia World Congress Center with over 5,000 attendees from airlines, corporations, and civil rights organizations worldwide. The event, hosted by Southeastern Airways, had become the premier gathering for companies committed to inclusive excellence. Marcus Thompson stood backstage preparing to deliver the keynote address when he noticed a familiar figure in the wings. Richard Whitman, now working as a diversity consultant, was setting up for his afternoon workshop titled "From Perpetrator to Partner, A Journey of Accountability." "Richard," Marcus acknowledged with a nod. "Marcus," Richard replied, then added, "Thank you, not just for the second chance, but for the wake-up call. My children are here today. They're proud of me for the first time in years." Before Marcus could respond, Keisha appeared with Mrs. Hartford, who would be introducing him. The elderly woman had become the moral center of the movement, her presence lending gravitas to the cause. "Ready to change the world again, young man?" Mrs. Hartford asked with a sparkle in her eye. "Just trying to keep the momentum going," Marcus replied humbly. "Nonsense," she said firmly. "You're not keeping anything going. You're accelerating it. That announcement you're about to make, that's going to ripple across every industry in America." The announcement she referred to was the creation of the Dignity Standard, a certification program that companies could earn by meeting rigorous standards for inclusive practices. 20 major corporations had already committed to pursuing certification. As Marcus walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, he thought about the journey from seat 1A to this moment. In the audience, he could see Jennifer training a new class of flight attendants, Patricia Whitman sitting with her advocacy group, and hundreds of Southeastern Airways employees who had become ambassadors for change. "A year ago," Marcus began, "I sat in a first-class seat and refused to move. Today we're here to ensure that no one ever has to make that choice again. Not because we've eliminated prejudice, that's a longer journey, but because we've created systems that make discrimination costly, accountability inevitable, and dignity profitable." The audience leaned forward as Marcus unveiled the next phase, a $10 billion fund to help other companies implement dignity standards, interest-free loans for minority-owned businesses to compete for airline contracts, and a scholarship program sending 1,000 students from underrepresented communities to aviation schools. But the most important announcement, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium, is that I'm stepping down as CEO of Southeastern Airways. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not because the work is done, but because it's begun. Real change doesn't depend on one person. It depends on systems, on culture, on collective commitment. Keisha Williams, who a year ago was a flight attendant fighting alone for justice, will become the new CEO. She doesn't need me to maintain dignity standards. She embodies them. Keisha walked onto the stage to a standing ovation, tears streaming down her face. The flight attendant, who had documented discrimination, was about to become the first Black woman to run a major U.S. airline. As Marcus handed her the microphone, she whispered, "I won't let you down." "You won't let them down, while," Marcus corrected, gesturing to the audience. "This isn't my legacy, it's ours." In his closing remarks, Marcus returned to the theme that had defined the movement: dignity is not negotiable. It's not a luxury for the few, but a right for all. Every time we board a plane, enter a boardroom, or walk into any space where we've been told we don't belong, we have a choice. We can accept the limitations others place on us, or we can claim our seat and refuse to move. As the conference continued, breakout sessions, led by former adversaries now working together, the transformation was evident, not just in policies but in hearts. The revolution that had started with one man refusing to give up his seat had become a movement of millions refusing to give up their dignity. That evening, Marcus sat in a quiet corner of the hotel bar journal, open writing by hand as he always did. A young woman approached hesitantly. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Sarah Chen from Northwestern. I'm writing my thesis on the dignity movement. Could I ask you one question?" Marcus gestured to the seat across from him. "Of course, bro. If you could go back to that morning, knowing everything that would follow, the confrontation, the public scrutiny, the death threats you received, the complete upheaval of your private life, would you still refuse to move?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Every single time, because my dignity was never about that seat. It was about every person who would come after me, who would face that same moment of choosing between compliance and dignity. If my refusing to move made it easier for even one person to claim their worth, then every consequence was worth it." Sarah thanked him and left to rejoin her colleagues. Marcus returned to his journal, writing the final entry for this chapter of his life. "Tomorrow I fly to Ghana, to the village my great-great-grandfather was taken from in chains. I'll fly economy middle seat if that's what's available. Because I know now that dignity isn't about where you sit. It's about knowing you have the right to sit anywhere. It's about ensuring others have that same right. It's about refusing to move not from stubbornness, but from love. Love for those who came before and couldn't refuse, and love for those who come after and shouldn't have to. The seat was never about the seat, it was about the soul." As Marcus closed his journal, his phone buzzed with a message from the young MIT student. "Made Dean's List. Accepted summer internship at NASA. Started campus group called Dignity in STEM. None of this would have happened if you hadn't shown me I belonged. Thank you for refusing to move." Marcus smiled, stood, and headed to his room to pack. Tomorrow's flight would take him across an ocean, but the journey that had started in seat 1A had already taken him much further. From a world where dignity was determined by dollars to one, where it was recognized as the birthright of every human being, the movement would continue without him at the helm of Southeastern Airways. It would grow, evolve, face setbacks, and celebrate victories. But it would never go backward. Because once people claim their dignity, once they refuse to be moved, the only direction is forward. As he reached his room, and Marcus saw Richard Whitman in the hallway talking animatedly with his college-age children about the workshop they'd attended on unconscious bias. Their faces showed the kind of engagement that comes from genuine learning, not obligation. Dad, Richard's daughter was saying, "I'm proud of you for owning your mistakes and working to fix them." That takes real courage. Richard saw Marcus and nodded, a gesture that carried the weight of a journey from arrogance to humility, from discrimination to advocacy, from seat 1B to a new understanding of what it meant to belong. Marcus nodded back, then entered his room. Through his window, he could see planes taking off from Hartsfield-Jackson, each one carrying the promise of dignity for all who flew. The boy who'd been told he didn't belong had not just claimed his seat, he'd made sure everyone could claim theirs. And that was how dignity became not just non-negotiable, but inevitable.